Welcome, everyone, to my introduction to this week's podcast of Listening to America. Beau Breslin, one of my favorite scholars from Skidmore College, and I talk about the elections of American history and, more importantly, early conspiracies. So David Horton and I recently have been talking about conspiracies generally and the psychology of them. But this is a more cerebral approach. And Beau Breslin is a great political scientist. We talked about some really fascinating things. He did a lot of work to prepare. One is that the Declaration of Independence itself is part of a conspiracy theory, that Jefferson was propagandizing our independence by saying there is a conspiracy by the British ministry and the crown to enslave us. And again, to use that term is always a little weird for Thomas Jefferson, but so it goes. And he believed that there was a systematic attempt by the British to pauperize and subordinate and recolonize the American system, and that therefore we had no choice but to declare independence. And then, perhaps even more insightful, is his view that the Constitutional Convention itself was a conspiracy because the states didn't authorize a wholesale revision of the Articles of Confederation. They only authorized a couple of amendments to the economic issues, particularly that of federal taxation. And so the minute that the Founding Fathers got to Philadelphia, they tore up the Articles of Confederation and began again. And so this was a conspiracy, a cabal, if you want to call it that, of 55 like-minded or essentially like-minded white men to build a stronger centralized constitution. And they roped George Washington into coming and giving it the credibility that it needed. Meanwhile, there was a sitting government of the United States. The Articles of Confederation were still operating, and that was the year that the Northwest Ordinance was passed, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. So that's a fascinating story. And then we talked also about the civil rights movement and the South's belief that there was a conspiracy by Northern interests and industrial banking interests to destroy the South or to hold it back and to meddle with its own internal ideas of how to organize its society, and of course the issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery into the American West. Utterly fascinating. And then in the end, we talk a little bit, just for a moment or two, about the Kennedy assassination, which is one of my current obsessions, but not enough to get in the way. Fascinating. And he also recommends a couple of books. One is A Lot of People Are Saying by Rosenblum and another writer, and also The New Jim Crow. So we'll post those. But this is exactly what I live to do, my friends. I'm actually in a motel room in greater Chicago today, and you're along for the ride, and I'm so glad you're along for the ride. Listening to America has blown open the doors of my life. Amazing, and I'm so glad that you're part of this, and if you can help us financially, now's the time. You know, the New Year's and tax season are coming. We frankly need funds to do this right. Next year it's Lewis and Clark, so I start at Monticello in late April, and I will work my way to Astoria, but I'll also be doing stops in every direction along the Ohio River, along the Mississippi. They were on the Mississippi for a short time, but I'll be going up to the Marias in Montana, where Lewis had his skirmish with 8 young Blackfeet men. I'll be following other side trails of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So again, it's something I love. I love Steinbeck. And I love Lewis and Clark. That's actually one of my principal intellectual interests. I'm the editor of We Proceeded On, which is the Lewis and Clark Quarterly Journal, which you should subscribe to by going to the website at Great Falls. Just type in Lewis and Clark Journal We Proceeded On, and it'll take you to the site for about $60 or something. You get the 4 editions per year, and you get to come to our conferences and so on and so forth. And so next year will be fabulous. And in year 3, if I'm still alive, I will be following Theodore Roosevelt's conservation footprint around the United States. So lots and lots coming. This is really just the time of my life, and I'm so delighted that you are part of it. And I hope you'll tell all your friends and contribute to the success of our program if you can. So let's go to the show. Beau Breslin of Skidmore College talking about early American conspiracies that have a more Jeffersonian and constitutional basis than the ones that we think about every day in our own time. We recorded this just 5 days before the election of 2024, so we have no idea what's about to happen in either direction. Let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. One of my favorite guests, Beau Breslin, is on the Zoom call at the other end of America at Skidmore College. We're recording this just a few days before the election of 2024. Who knows what that means? We both have lots of thoughts about that, but let's just leave that to the people of the United States. Jefferson would say the people will choose. And here's the thing, Beau, elections matter. So by this time next week, somebody will have won the election in the Electoral College. Even if whichever side one is on this question, elections matter. The president will name several scores of people, maybe hundreds of people, to the lower courts for life tenured positions. America's place in the world will be determined by how the executive handles our relationship to NATO, to our European allies, to our perceived enemies in the world. This is a very, very consequential moment, and none of us should pretend that it's not of enormous importance this time, because in a typical election, let's just say it's between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, we then felt that our basic American approach to the world and towards policy was going to be about the same. There would be some adjustments, but there was no question about whether we still believed in NATO. There was no question about things like tariffs and so on. They were really talking about two essentially centrist parties that were deciding how taxation policy should work and how large the welfare state should be allowed to grow and so on. In this election, whatever your politics, we have a candidate who is very skeptical about the traditional liberal world order that emerged after World War II and wants to really shake that up and maybe withdraw from NATO. We have a candidate who, by his own admission, is not fond of the norms and is willing to disrupt. And so this is an unusually important election, but my point is that elections matter. That when this happens, if we really are American patriots, we should all say, okay, the election has been decided. We have the president, may not be my choice, but we need to sort of get behind this paradigm and fight the good fight, but live within the boundaries of civic exchange for the next 4 years. That sounds pretty Pollyanna, doesn't it?
No, I mean, I think you're exactly right. What I say to my students, Clay, a lot is not just that elections matter, and I say that all the time, but this election is distinct. I do believe that this election is the most consequential of my lifetime. And as you know, I'm 58 years old, so I've lived through a lot of elections. This one is the most consequential for a variety of reasons. I do think the Supreme Court is one thing that we could spend a good deal of time talking about, and NATO and other pieces. But I also think that just the future of the presidency is going to be defined by this particular election. And this one might be the most consequential for a variety of reasons. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the Senate and the House are meaningful as well in terms of guardrails for American politics.
No matter who wins, that would be certainly the case. And, you're a political scientist. I think my reading of it is that Americans actually like divided government. They like at least one of the houses of Congress to be of the other party so that we don't have a kind of a runaway period of 4 years. You have to harken back to the age of Lyndon Johnson, where one party would control both houses in a significant way. Typically, Americans make divided government the process, and it slows things down, which is what the Founding Fathers had in mind, but it also provides safeguards. So let's say that a Democrat wins with strong progressive urges. If you have a Republican Senate, that's going to prevent some of those things from being enacted in their fullness, and that's probably good. That a divided nation needs that sort of check on the power of any one party. If the other person wins, presumably the House or the Senate, if they're in Democrat hands, would be able to check some of the perceived excesses of that victory. And so
I'm a big fan of divided government. I think it muddies the water, it mucks up the system and all that kind of stuff. But I think that in the long run, that ends up being a good thing, especially when you have what I would describe as outlier presidents in terms of ideology. And although Trump may not be as much of an outlier when push comes to shove on the ground, he's certainly an outlier when it comes to the way he speaks and what he promises. And so divided government can help keep keep him in line. I think that's probably true. And the same thing is true for Kamala Harris on the left. She's quite progressive. You might need a Republican House or Senate in order to keep her in check.
But let's talk about conspiracy. We talked about it on a previous program a little bit, but I want you to bring a more bookish, a more theoretical approach to this. So what I've said is that conspiracies are inevitable. They go back deep into time, but trying to understand the motives of it. So, for example, let me just put a case to you. When Marjorie Taylor Greene says that the forest fires in California were started by Jewish lasers, either she is a moron, which is possible, or she just says this because it works, because it stirs things up, because it helps put money in the bank for her campaign re-election funds. In other words, I would think that she knows this can't be true. I would think that she is absolutely certain in her private life that this is an idiotic notion that she's just floating because she wants to disrupt our capacity for civic engagement and rational discourse. How do you read something like that? I'm picking a particularly idiotic conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right here. And what I would say, Clay, is a couple of things about the way in which the country, America, has both embraced and tried to distance itself from conspiracies, right? We think of conspiracies as generally negative. Conspiracies are part of the DNA of America. Why? How do we know that? Because at the moment of independence, at the moment of revolution, at the moment of the constitutional founding, at the moment for basically the first 50 years of American history, conspiracies were part of everyday political dialogue, everyday political nature. They were discussed widely. So take the Declaration of Independence. Bernard Bailyn, as a historian, one of the great historians, has said that the Declaration of Independence is a document steeped in conspiracy. The Declaration of Independence identifies the long train of abuses that they believe that the British are imposing on them. British are taking away our liberty. We need to, that's a conspiracy, right? There was a sense that some of that was true, but the idea was that we need to break away from Britain in order to reestablish our freedom and so on. So, and think about the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention, every element about the Constitutional Convention screams conspiracy, right? It's 55 men meeting secretly behind closed doors with a particular charge, right? Remember, the charge was to tinker with the Articles of Confederation. They scrapped that right off the bat. They have no authority to scrap that right off the bat. I always think of it as the framers as Illuminati, right? The framers as Freemasons, these secret societies. That's a secret society. And sure, how did they even recognized, the Constitutional Convention delegates, Clay, even recognized that they were engaged in a sort of secret cabal. How do we know that? Because they made a clause, Article 7, about ratification. They recognized that what they were doing was revolutionary, was beyond what the scope of their authority was. And so what I'll say is most historians, Bernard Bailyn, Richard Hofstadter, and so on, will talk about the fact that America was founded on the notion of conspiracy. But, and here's the big but, it's a very different type of conspiracy than we currently see with Marjorie Taylor Greene and a lot of the folks on the right, QAnon and so on. The conspiracies of the original and early republic were conspiracies that were genuine conspiracy theories. There was a theory, meaning a world, a vision of what was possible, a vision of where we want to go, a kind of national vision of an alternative. So think about the Declaration of Independence, right? We're getting abused by the British. We feel like that's a conspiracy against us, or our freedoms are being taken away. Jefferson has a vision for where we're going to go. It's independence, right? We get to be self-sovereign. We get to decide for ourselves how much liberty we're going to do. Now take the Constitutional Convention. Articles of Confederation not working, get the secret cabal, the secret conspiracy together, but they have a vision for the next step. They have a vision for America beyond this, and that is reflected in our Constitution and the preamble. So there is a theory to the conspiracy. Nowadays, there's a great book that I want your listeners to read. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy by two of the great political scientists out there. Russ Muirhead, he's at Dartmouth, Nancy Rosenblum at Harvard. The book is called A Lot of People Are Saying. And what they say, and I think they're brilliant, what they say is we now have conspiracies without theories. There are conspiracies out there, Marjorie Taylor Greene, QAnon, Stop the Steal, witch hunt, hoax. How many times have we heard that coming out of somebody like Donald Trump's mouth? But there's no vision for where we're going. There's no sort of national idea about where we go from here. It's just how much can I delegitimize my political opponent? How much chaos can I wreak? And how much can I get my group of supporters to be enthusiastic? There's no vision for where we want to go, and they call that conspiracy, not conspiracy theories. I think it's absolutely right, and I think Marjorie Taylor Greene is that, and I think social media has contributed to it. It's now all about repetition. Get your conspiracy out there, and if you say it enough, it's going to become true for your particular supporters. I think it's a tragedy in light of the fact that conspiracies were an important part of American history, and now they've become basically dangerous.
There's a lot there, Beau. I want to go back and pick up some of this. So talking with my friend Beau Breslin from Skidmore College, it's always such a pleasure. You're listening to the special edition just before the election of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. I'm talking to Beau Breslin of Skidmore College. It's the Friday before the election. Just to go to Marjorie Taylor Greene for a moment, we're just using her as an easy target here. But, and this is a bit absurd, but follow me. If she had said, Jewish lasers are destroying the forests of California, but I have a plan for better management of the forests. We're going to go in and we're going to cut down the dead trees. We're going to make them available to poor people in the United States. We're going to step back and rethink whether there should be state and local co-management of the forests. That would be what you're talking about. That's like, however absurd the conspiracy theory, it was meant to open up the possibility of reform and building a better national forest system. That would be a more positive approach, right?
Yes, and I think that would be in the spirit of what the narrative of conspiracies that has been a part of American history for a long time. Yes. Let's take for a moment the Bush versus Gore election, right? So we can talk about hanging chads and we can talk about the Florida election. The amount of litigation, Clay, that came out of that particular election, that was born in part out of a sense of conspiracy, right? We're not counting the Florida votes as much as we should. Al Gore was part of that. The idea, though, that once the Supreme Court made its decision in Bush versus Gore, and Al Gore steps down and concedes the election as a way to keep the nation moving forward, as a way of the peaceful transition of power, as a way of, quite frankly, prioritizing the nation's best interest over Al Gore's best interest. That's a conspiracy theory of the original founding. That's an idea that, sure, there was some conspiracy out there that was doing Al Gore in, but he had a vision for where the country ought to go, and it didn't include him.
So looking back at that for a moment, his concession speech, in retrospect, appears to be one of the great political moments of our lifetime, because he said, look, I have some misgivings here. I'm not sure this process was entirely fair, but the Supreme Court has made its choice. It's now important for all of us to get behind the Bush administration. I will be a loyal opposition, and I will do everything I can to help George W. Bush succeed. You know, at the time that seemed very noble. Now it seems profound. And I would just urge everyone who's listening to us to go to Google and listen to it. It's a short speech, but it's the very definition of civic virtue. And, virtue in the Christian world means something different from Roman virtue. Virtue was doing the right thing, getting over one's self-interest and looking at the commonwealth interests of the country, that there are things more important than your own private grievances and so on. So let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson says, look, we can probably take one oppressive law here and another one there, as long as this is sort of random. People are kind of disposed to live with this sort of thing. But when it's clear that there is a long train of deliberate abuses, that this is a pattern, this is a plan that the British have, and I'm going to use a very unfortunate word, to enslave us. And Jefferson uses that word without any sense of irony, but we'll leave that for the moment. But that this is a conspiracy of the British ministry and maybe the king too, to enslave us and to reduce us to pauperism and to a status of deeply subordinate that's not in keeping with British ideas of freedom and constitutionality. If that has happened, we now must declare independence. So the question is, did he really believe all that? And my answer is probably not. I think Jefferson was making the best case for the revolution. It's a piece of propaganda in addition to being one of the great political statements of all time. But surely he knew that the British didn't sit around thinking, how should we enslave the American colonists? That it was about taxing to pay for the French and Indian War, that it was about, someone might say, if you're British, oh, come on, Jefferson. You know that this is not really a systematic plan to reduce the colonies to some sort of deeply subordinate status. Fair enough, but as you say, he had a plan. We will now be independent. We will wage war. We will make money. We will collect taxes. We will do the things that a free and open republic will do. So that strikes me as a really interesting example. And you're right, that he was playing a conspiracy game. And he did it earlier in his first great pamphlet, A Summary View, which makes an overstated case against what the British are doing to the colonies. So I think that's a really great example. As to the Constitutional Convention, let's say a little bit more about that, just so everyone really understands. The Articles of Confederation were deemed to be highly imperfect, and they're really on two questions. One was on trade policy and economic questions, and this involved taxation. And the concern was that the national government did not have enough power to really tax sufficiently to be a nation, and that we were going to have to fix this before we went on. And they were also concerned that it required too great a consensus to do major things, that you needed to bring down that bar a little bit so that you don't have to have unanimity on everything and so on. So those are honest concerns. And remember, there was the Annapolis conference that failed, and then Madison and Hamilton say, well, let's meet again and let's really do it this time. And they managed to get a quorum. The first thing they do is tear up the Constitution, which they did not have legal or even moral authority to do. They were violating their very set of instructions from the individual states. And many of the people there knew this and said, geez, if we go back to New Jersey or we go back to Pennsylvania, try to explain this, we're going to be in a pot of trouble. And then they operate in secrecy for the whole summer of 1787. And so when we look at it now, it can be seen as a cabal or a conspiracy that got ahead of itself and produced an extraordinarily good constitution on the whole, but without legal authority to do so. And you say that's why they went to special efforts at the end to say, oh, we better run this by all the states here before we ratify it.
Lots to digest there. One of the things I will say, let's spend a moment. You're exactly right. You described both Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention correctly. Let's spend a moment, Clay, thinking about ratification for just a second, right? So the great historian Gordon Wood said ratification conventions just were not part of the equation back then, right? So in some ways, the idea that you could get together with a group of folks and decide whether to vote up or down on the Constitution was a revolutionary and new idea. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention were smart enough to realize that their radical revolution ripping up the Articles of Confederation and starting over again. They're
conspiring to create a new system of government.
Correct. Having a new vision for the polity, right? The idea of that this Constitution could bring together a more perfect union, right? There's the image of progress there. And so what's super interesting is that technically, and there were some people who probably drew the line here, technically, what should have ratification looked like? Well, it should have been the ratification identified in the Articles of Confederation, because that's what's being replaced.
That's still the instrument in place at the time of the ratification.
Until you get at least 9, right? They ended up getting all 13 states to ratify. But until you got at least 9, the Articles of Confederation is the fundamental law of the land. So the idea that you could not only change the rules of the game, i.e. new constitution, but then decide how you are going to play the game, ratification, on your own terms, is entirely revolutionary. And, they were smart enough to be able to get that past most state legislatures. But I'm guessing there's a fair number of people at the time who were scratching their heads saying, well, we have a constitution. This one hasn't been ratified. The Articles of Confederation is still the governing document. Why shouldn't we get unanimity, which is what the Articles of Confederation called for when it came to ratification? Any changes to the Articles of Confederation, all states had to agree to it. It is a conspiracy in the most interesting and, quite frankly, most intellectual way. Kudos to the Madisons and the Gouverneur Morrises and the Wilsons and Morrises of the world for being able to sort of fool, for lack of a better term, fool those outside of Independence Hall, which was the Pennsylvania State House at the time, fool those and get the folks to engage with their Constitution in an entirely revolutionary way.
You mentioned that we still had a government of the United States at the time under the Articles of Confederation. So imagine this: the sitting government of the United States knows that across town there's a coup d'etat, a gentle, benevolent coup d'etat occurring. But during that time, they passed one of the major pieces of legislation in American history, that is the Congress, not the Constitutional Convention, which was the Northwest Ordinance, which had enormous influence on the way the West was developed, because the Northwest Ordinance, among other things, said new states are going to come in on an equal basis. They're going to have school lands that are set aside forever to support schools. They must all be small r republic in nature. There will be no slavery above the Ohio River. And they also said, one of the clauses that has been systematically ignored in American history, that with respect to Native Americans, to Indians, the government of the United States must always show, quote, the utmost good faith. Well, that turned out to be a dead letter, but think of that. One of the, almost as important as the Constitution itself, was this incredibly major piece of legislation passed by the outgoing government that had no way of knowing that it was about to be replaced by a conspiracy of self-selected people, who wanted to do something different and wanted a much stronger central government. This is why the anti-federalists were so upset, because they thought this should not have happened in this way. You're sneaking in a centralized government that we have never really wanted. And Jefferson, by the way, leans both ways on this, but he leans mostly towards the anti-federalists and says, Virginia is kind of its own country. I like the Articles of Confederation. Maybe we should have really just amended it in a couple of ways. So pick up any part of that you want.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up the third one because I'm going to throw it back in your lap. Let's think for a moment about Jefferson's, what I think is a phenomenal idea, right? That the earth belongs to the living, that every generation ought to write its own constitution. Okay, at some level, the Constitutional Convention is kind of fulfilling that aspiration. The Articles of Confederation hadn't been around for 19 years. Jefferson thought, wait 19 years and then meet in convention and so on. But what's interesting is, and I need to ask you as the Jefferson expert here, what would Jefferson have said about legislation and the continuation of important legislation like Northwest Ordinance when you had a new constitution come up every 19 years? does legislation just continue, or do we start with a tabula rasa all over again? It's something that Jefferson never considered.
This is what drove Madison crazy, because in theory, Jefferson, in my opinion, is absolutely right. That here we are in 2024 stuck with this Constitution that was written by men in wigs and tights, 55 white men, many of them slaveholders. I mean, there is no way that this can be regarded as legitimate according to current democratic theory. And if we had a constitutional convention today and tried to have 55 white men write it, imagine the blowback from the world, including, of course, the United States. And so Jefferson's right in theory that each generation needs to build its own way of looking at public affairs. I mean, how do we look at cyber terror? How do we look at the kind of ubiquitous pornography of our time? The anarchy of the internet? How do we look at cruise missiles and nuclear weapons? And how do we look at space war, where we're now contemplating having laser wars in space against other nations? It would have been regarded as the veriest science fiction that anyone said. The day will come when you have a little thing in your hand with which you can communicate with the entire world instantly. So they couldn't know us. And Jefferson's view is we need a constitution that is equal to our own needs and our own concerns and our own challenges. So I'm with him 100%. And I think that the greatest problem of America today is that we're stuck with a constitution that does not actually provide a mechanism for us to sort out the issues of our time. However, Madison's view was, well, wait a minute. There needs to be some sense of the majesty of a constitution. If you're tearing them up from time to time, people are not going to take them as seriously as they must for government to operate. And secondly, you can't go to a blank slate. You've got to have some continuity. Some things have to be grandfathered over, or you can't be. What's the status of contract? Are you going to change the nature of contract in your next constitutional revision? Are you going to decide that Texas is no longer a state? I mean, are you going to mess with the 2 senators from each state clause? So Madison's view was there has to be some kind of continuity in the nature of a social compact, Mr. Jefferson. And I think Jefferson's answer to that is, yeah, but if you just always think about what I'm saying, you'll be better off. In other words, the legitimacy of a constitution begins to erode after a certain period, and you need processes, formal rituals of national renewal. And I'm sure Jefferson would have said, if asked, we'll probably continue almost everything. We'll just attend to the things that really, really need to be attended to. So I think both were right in this question, but I thank God that Jefferson wrote this letter, because you and I are talking about it, and it helps us illuminate and clarify the problem that we're in at this moment.
I actually think his ideas about periodic constitutional renewal are brilliant. It's a shame, Clay, that American society doesn't engage with that in the same way that Jefferson did. He could never convince a great number of people. He tried to convince Madison. He tried to convince Samuel Kercheval, and they're like, no, you're nuts. You're crazy. That's not going to work. He's having a heyday at the state level, at least. He's having a renaissance at the state level, because about 20 states now have some system that way. But think about back then, right? They are not dummies, right? The Constitutional Convention delegates are not dumb. So they have to decide about how many states should ratify. And why pick 9, right? So the Article 7 says that if 9 states ratify, this Constitution will become authoritative in those states that ratify.
Why 9 and not 7?
Why 9 and not 7, right? Why 9 and not unanimity? Well, as you said, they didn't think they would get unanimity, but why 9? And so there's this great legal scholar, Mark Graber, who argues that they went for 9 because they thought they could get close to 9, and then the 4 that were outliers wouldn't necessarily want to remain as independent states. They'd be like, hey, don't forget about us. Wait for us kind of mentality. That would topple the other 4. But they thought they did this calculation that they thought they might be able to get 9. And if they get 9, those other 4 would come along eventually, because they didn't want to be left out of what is a good economic game. I think that's a fascinating, we talk about the Constitutional Convention delegates as sort of heroes, and we have this kind of hagiography about them, and we put them on a pedestal. They were political, calculated folks. They're just trying to change the direction of the country with the new constitution. And everything that they did had some political importance, some political maneuvering that went on, most evidently by the ratification and the compromises, right? All the compromises about slavery and representation and so on.
The idea was, well, if we get to 9, a supermajority, so that would give legitimacy. A simple majority would give less legitimacy to the new government. So you don't like a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court. You want a 9-0 decision if possible, because that gives a sense of authoritas, as the Romans would have put it, to whatever the decision is. And it worked, because Rhode Island had wanted nothing to do with any of this. But a couple of years later, they thought, well, I guess we better join the club, or, we're just little Rhode Island. And so it worked. And Jefferson was on board with that formula too. We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to ask you about conspiracies deeper into the 19th century. I'm talking with Beau Breslin of Skidmore College. We're doing this 4 or 5 days before the election of 2024. So that means that our minds are pure. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to the special edition of Listening to America. Beau Breslin is across from me. All right, so let's go to conspiracy theories again. So here's one. The southern states, the slaveholding states, the Carolinas, Georgia, and then eventually Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so on, they have believed from the beginning that there was a conspiracy by northern interests to damage their economy, and particularly to meddle with their peculiar institution, slavery. And not only did they justify slavery, but they said it's economically essential. And they said, even if it's wrong, and some of them did acknowledge that it was wrong, only Virginia can fix this, only Louisiana can fix this, that the North had no standing in this, that for the North to think that it could meddle in this would be an appalling tyranny, and so on. They had a conspiracy theory going deep into their souls that I would say continues to have some legacy today. What say you?
Yeah, I think that's true. If I can be personal for a second here, my dad grew up in Selma, Alabama. I've been across the Edmund Pettus Bridge a lot of times. My dad grew up in Selma, and I grew up in the Northeast. And so we had conversations like this, right? And so I have a slight glimpse into the mind of what I would describe as a Southern intellectual. My dad we went to Colgate as an undergrad. He went to Wharton as a graduate student. He was a Southern intellectual, and yet he was fiercely Southern. We used to joke about the fact that he would only watch the first few episodes of Ken Burns' Civil War, because at that time the South was winning the war, and he'd stopped watching it.
How surprised he was when the war turned.
Yes, absolutely. And he never could quite swallow that. Though he was progressive about race, right? He grew up in a household in which his African-American nanny couldn't eat in the same room as his family. And so he was very progressive about race, went to Colgate just to get out of the South in that way. My point is, Clay, that what we would describe as that conspiracy, that oppression from the North, that sort of prioritizing the interests of the North in a country that has lots of different regions, lots of different cultures, which you're discovering on your Steinbeck tour, that oppressive nature of the North imposing its will on the South is real. It was real in my dad's mind, and I'm sure it's real today.
I think what you're saying is that there is some legitimacy to the South's belief that we're sovereign states. You can't develop a one-size-fits-all policy in faraway Washington and impose it on us. And I think the same was felt during Brown v. Board of Education too. Like, we get it, we have a problem here, but we resent the Supreme Court of the United States telling us who we are and what justice is and how we should behave. Neither one of us is in any way defending racism, race prejudice, slavery, apartheid, bigotry, and so on. But you're saying that the South had a legitimate concern about being subordinated to the growing industrial northern interests of the country, and that as historians we need to factor that in even though, of course, we abhor slavery and its legacy.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things about that. Imagine for the moment that the roles were reversed and that, the South had won the Civil War or had been what I would describe as sort of the dominant Hamiltonian economic power and imposed its will on the North, right? I live in New York. I'd be pretty irritated myself. So, but a couple of things that I think are interesting, and I'll throw these in for you to ruminate on. I can't remember the name of the political scientists, but there's a great argument about Brown versus Board of Education that Chief Justice Warren's kind of aggressive approach to get unanimity and achieve unanimity in that 9-0 decision in Brown versus Board of Education actually made it more difficult for Southern school districts to desegregate because they didn't feel like they had a voice on the Supreme Court. They felt like it was kind of the Northern Washington imposing its will. And as you see, it wasn't until the 1964 and 65 civil rights laws that Southern states started to desegregate, right? There's this great, the Hollow Hope is a great book written by a political scientist that demonstrates almost no desegregation, almost no integration of schools happened between 1954 Brown versus Board of Education and the 1964-65 civil rights legislation. And that's because Southern school districts didn't feel like they were being heard. And so there's an argument that if the decision in Brown had been 7-2 or 8-1 or 6-3, Southern states might have felt like they had at least been heard. It's a small argument, but it's a super interesting one.
No, I think it's a really interesting argument, Beau, because with the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965, had to work their way through intense debate, filibusters, and other tactics in the Congress of the United States. The Southern senators and the Southern representatives defended their own interests. They combated what they took to be Northern notions about all of this. And eventually those laws were passed largely because of the martyrdom of JFK and LBJ's incredible political capacities. But the view would be then this is the process. This is the set of rules we have. And the Congress has debated this, and although we don't like it and we may even resist it, our voices were heard. Our representatives defended our way of life. We were not just imposed upon. Yes, we think that the Congress made the wrong decisions here, and we may resist, but at least there was a debate, whereas the Supreme Court, speaking ex cathedra 9-0, presuming it knows what's best for human justice, did not give us a chance to truly make the case for ourselves. Is that the point?
Yeah, that's the point. It's interesting because, back in the 60s, Congress was a powerful institution, right? Sure, in those examples, as you draw, Southern representatives, Southern legislators, they weren't happy. They were upset about the outcome of some of these pieces of legislation. But they had a mentality that they would live to fight another day. Right now, you have a Congress that is unwilling to even engage in that sort of level of conversation. So back to the Supreme Court. Don't get me wrong, Earl Warren is in a tight spot, right? He's in a real dilemma. On the one hand, I always tell my students, Brown versus Board of Education is arguably the most important, it's not the most impactful, but the most important decision of the 20th century. It's hard to argue that it wasn't. And Earl Warren understood that. He got that this was a monumental moment. Think about the NAACP sort of setting him up along the way with cases that had gone for 20 years to get to this point. It wasn't like Brown versus Board of Education pops out of nowhere. So Earl Warren's in a tight spot. And he recognizes that if he allows some to perhaps dissent, it won't be as powerful an outcome. He doesn't know what the future holds. He thinks that it won't be as powerful a message for the country at a time when they needed the message. And so he is aggressive, he's brusque about it, he gets the unanimity, and ultimately it backfires a little bit because there is very little integration for the next 10 years in the Southern school districts.
But a more generous way to look at that would be to say Truman integrates the armed forces by executive order. Right. Eisenhower passes some pretty milquetoast civil rights legislation, but enforces the integration of schools in Little Rock. That Brown v. Board of Education may be politically ineffective in terms of immediate impact, but it helps to create the ethos that will lead to the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. In other words, that its immediate impact is of little importance if it helped to create the sense that this is a justice that now must be done.
If the equal protection clause means anything, it means that separate but equal is unconstitutional. It means that integration is necessary for the country to progress. And so absolutely right. And quite frankly, I love to talk about the fact that Brown versus Board of Education, even if it made no difference for another 10 years past the 64 and 65 civil rights legislation, it's still the most important case of the 20th century.
Just apropos of that, I've been reading Robert Kagan's new book, Rebellion, which I strongly urge you to take a look at. I really love his work. He wrote The Jungle Grows Back about the potential end of the liberal world order, and I think that's a chilling book that we should all be reading now. But here's what I love about you, and I love about our conversations, is that we're talking as political theorists, as scientists, as historians, as humanists. We're not necessarily endorsing this or that. We're saying, here are the dynamics of American life. These are the dynamics, and nothing is as simple as it seems. And you have to factor in things that may be uncomfortable for you. For example, elections matter. And if Donald Trump, for all of the things that we now know about him, can still be elected to the presidency of the United States, we have to say, that's democracy, folks. But the other side thinks, and I've been listening to right-wing radio for the past 2 weeks, they're saying if Kamala Harris is elected, it's the end of America as we know it, that these are conspiracy people, that they're rigging the election, that they intend to make us a communist nation, they may be a Maoist nation, that they're going to disarm people of their guns. So both sides are in an apocalyptic, paranoid mood, and both sides credit the other one as an actual conspiracy to destroy America. And when I listen to that, I think, it's not moral equivalency exactly. But I know that if you don't understand that that's how the right actually feels, you cannot understand this country.
Agreed. Completely agreed. And the fact of the matter is, for better or worse, Jefferson had a response to this in some ways, right? So he has this famous letter to Charles Yancey on January 6, 1816, in which he says, and I'll quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be," right? The functionaries...
Guilty.
Right? But his point was we need to be both educated and we need to be knowledgeable. And if we give away our ability to understand truth, right, understand what's going on, then, at the end of the day, the country will fall apart and we are to blame.
And we are to blame. It seems to me that Jefferson may prove to be absolutely a bubble-headed utopian on this question, but I agree with him 100%. If you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect something that never has been and never can be in a state of civilization. He also said to his mentor, George Wythe, "Enlighten the people generally, and every form of tyranny, both of body and mind, will disappear like the fog when the sun rises in the morning." So there's the more optimistic side of Jefferson. But I've been thinking about this all week. The number of people on every side of the political spectrum who operate simply by hunch. My gut reaction is X. My gut reaction is Y. That it has nothing to do with evidence, has nothing to do with hard reading, it has nothing to do with deliberation. It just is, I'm an American, I have a hunch about something, that must count.
Right, a conspiracy without a theory, right? I have a sense that Kamala Harris is going to destroy the country because, there's absolutely no evidence that that's going to happen, Clay. But if you have a hunch and you go to the voting booth with that hunch, that ends up being troubling.
Fascinating. So just as we close here, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you. I want you to tell me again the name of the book we're all to read.
Okay. Well, there are a couple. So a quick read is a lot of people are saying The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy by Russ Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum about conspiracies. And then I think at some point in everybody's lives, they ought to take a look at Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, even if you disagree with it. And there are reasons to disagree with it, right? Even if you think that she's a little fast and loose with the data or so on. The idea that she brings up that mass incarceration is in fact the new way in which folks will trying to control a racial group is at least worth noodling over, at least worth contemplating.
And again, this is what I so admire about you, because it's not really about whether you agree 100% with that book. It's that that book forces you to think about things that you haven't thought about in that way. And even if you wind up rejecting 10% of it or 82% of it, some of it is certainly true. We have about 3 minutes. This is going to be unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway. Who killed John Kennedy? My favorite. So I hate conspiracy theories. I don't think that Jewish lasers touched off fires in Florida. I don't think that Sandy Hook was an inside job. I don't think that 9/11 was an inside job. I don't think that the moon landing was filmed in a Hollywood soundstage. I reject almost all conspiracy theories. This is one I don't. I believe that this is a conspiracy, and I want you, I know this is not your area of expertise, nor is it mine, but who do you think killed John Kennedy?
Yeah, in preparation for this episode, I spent a lot of time with it, and at one point it was 3 out of every 4 Americans did not believe that it was the work of a single individual, Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 out of 4. I mean, can you imagine? We can't. 3 out of 4 Americans can't decide that today is Friday. So at that time, I agree with you. It's hard to imagine a situation in which this is the work of a single individual. I'm not so sure that Jim Garrison, the New Orleans lawyer's theory is the right one. But I think there's a lot more to it than just the single guy in the book depository taking out Kennedy.
I just went to Dallas, and I went on the 6th floor, and then I went down to the street and looked at the grassy knoll, and we drove to Parkland Hospital and under the underpass, and then we went to where Oswald was arrested in the theater, and we went to the boarding house where he was staying, and then this might sound a little macabre, but I said, can we go to his grave in Fort Worth? And we went to his grave in Fort Worth, and I sat there for half an hour just kind of thinking, what a bizarre moment this was in American history. But, my friends who are lone gunman people, and that's the great majority, say, well, by now someone would have spilled the beans. I mean, you got conspiracy of hundreds of people can't possibly survive for 70 years and so on. I'm not so sure about that. And I think that when Oswald said, I'm a patsy, I think in some sense he was telling the truth.
That's right. And I think so my question to you is, what if Jack Ruby doesn't assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald? That's the evidence for me that really kind of tips the balance is, why did you have to get rid of Lee Harvey Oswald? Like Jack Ruby, at some level, that strikes me as there's a cover up there. And the other thing I will say is nobody should believe that secrets and conspiracies can't be hidden from the American public over long periods of time, right? And it's a different era, but really we didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about what went on in the Constitutional Convention until Madison came out with his notes, 50 years later. So secrets and conspiracies can be hidden from the American people for a long period of time.
Yeah, I agree. So I've been reading about Jack Ruby, and this is what happens to, I think, people who are rational. I've always thought he killed Lee Harvey Oswald to keep him from spilling, keep him from talking. And I do feel that Oswald could have been broken, that without torture, Oswald would have said whatever he knew over time. So maybe yes. But then when I've been reading recently about Ruby, there's evidence in the other direction too, that it was almost like an impulsive thing that he did. It's hard. His behavior doesn't square 100% with a kind of a mafia hit on Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's what happens. The more you study, the more complicated things get. But it is the only conspiracy theory that I believe in, although I'm kind of intrigued at the notion that lasers started the forest fires in California. I don't believe in the Jewish international conspiracy to burn down America's forests, but you got to give her some credit for whoppers. Beau, sure. I've so enjoyed this. This has been an incredible conversation. I think you and I should plan a program later this year where we both dig in a little more on Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And it's not about, we can't solve this problem, but maybe we could do this. How does a rational being try to sort something like this out when it's half a century later? I think that would be a very useful thing. What's the methodology of trying to sort out a question of this gravity? So I so appreciate you. thanks for doing all the work on this. We will post the books that you have suggested, and I'm going to read The New Jim Crow ASAP. And for the rest of you, we'll see you next week for another edition of Listening to America.